Today I will tell you a new kind of story. You will not believe how harmful the small group of Russian soldiers in World War I were able to defend Auschwitz Castle. It is one of the terrible and inspiring stories, and one of the strangest war stories you can hear in your life. Let's go. Let's have fun. On August 3, 1915, in World War I, a 21-year-old Russian soldier named Vladimir Kotlitsky was looking out from behind the huge stone walls of Auschwitz Castle in Poland. He was watching the same landscape that he had seen the previous 6 months while serving in the castle. Around this castle, there was a large forest surrounded on all sides, and this forest was full of swamps. In addition, this castle was surrounded by dozens and dozens of moats. These trenches are deep, long holes that soldiers dig to hide in when they are attacked, and from there they launch their attacks on the enemies while they are protected behind the trench walls. This network of winding trenches was created around Auschwitz Castle, and after that the Germans occupied these trenches when they were fighting with the Russians during World War I. The Germans were going crazy over Auschwitz Castle and wanted to take it from the Russians because it was in a very important strategic location with a railway line passing through it. There was a river close to the castle, and the castle was in the hands of any of the fighting teams, helping greatly in transporting its supplies, ammunition, and equipment during this time of war. But despite repeated attempts by the Germans, numbering 7,000 soldiers, to control Auschwitz Castle during the past 6 months, they were repelled by Vladimir and the small Russian force, which numbered 900 soldiers inside the castle. On the morning of August 3, 1915, when Vladimir was looking at the German soldiers in the trenches and following the battles between them, it was clear that these battles had reached the stage of stalemate. None of the parties was trying to attack the other, nor was any of them willing to leave their place. The two of them were sitting as they could without doing anything, and out of boredom, the Russian soldiers who were hidden inside the castle sneaked out the back door to the river, caught fish with their hands, and took it back to the castle. But on this morning, Vladimir noticed something strange happening in one of the trenches near the river. This trench is about 100 meters from the castle, but from his place, from above, he could clearly see what was happening inside the trench. He saw a group of German officers with high standards and high salaries. They were gathered together and looking at the ground inside the trench, and Vladimir did not know what they were looking at inside the trench. He saw that the trench was empty, and then the German officers looked at the sky and waved their hands in strange movements, and then they looked at the ground again. Vladimir had no idea why they were doing this. He couldn't see what they were looking at inside the trench, and when he looked up at the sky, they weren't moving their hands, and he couldn't see anything in the sky, just a normal blue sky. But whatever those German officers were doing made him upset. Vladimir was a young officer, meaning he was responsible for the soldiers with him. But because he was new to the service, he did not have enough experience in wars and was not considered a senior commander in the army. That is why, when Vladimir saw these Western movements that the Germans were making, he was nervous and did not know what to do. That is, should he leave his place and go and inform the commander's superiors that he saw the Germans looking at the ground and moving their hands in the sky. So he felt that if he informed the commander's superiors of what they saw, they would laugh at him, and he would be a commander. Funny. So he decided to stay in his place and watch the Germans make these strange movements. He said to himself that he was worried why, as long as no one fired at us, there would be no attack, and whatever the Germans were doing was irrelevant. So he descended from the castle where the Germans were watching and did not care about what they saw, and went inside to talk to the rest of the soldiers about anything. After 3 days, at 4 o'clock in the evening, the Russian soldiers who were keeping watch around the walls of the castle noticed that something strange was happening in the darkness around him. He noticed that the forest and trees were moving before their eyes, and the vision around them was blurry, and the Russians did not know what to do with this fog, so he asked some of the soldiers to come, to help them know what this is, and during the next few minutes, as the Russian soldiers saw this fog from behind the castle walls, they realized what this was. The fog was approaching them like a cloud, but it was moving on the ground, and the color of this cloud was greenish-gray, and the cloud was very large, the size of the castle they were in, and the wind was moving this cloud towards the castle. The Russian soldiers had no idea who was entering upon them, and all they did was stand and watch the cloud in a state of silence and astonishment. As soon as this cloud touched any plant or grass coming out of the ground, the grass quickly turned black. The Russian soldiers began to hear the sounds of strange movement in the clouds, and this strange movement was due to the falling birds that were killed by this cloud. The Russian soldiers felt terrified and panicked and asked the rest of the team to come and help them in the attack. The soldiers began to breathe in the deadly chemical smell that entered the atmosphere of the castle, and after a short while, he began to hear some of the soldiers throwing a solid glass. What happened explains the strange movements that the German officers were making. When Vladimir was looking at them, he was surprised why they were looking at the ground and then looking at the sky and looking at the ground again. It turned out that they were preparing for a chemical attack on Auschwitz Castle, and they were placing poison gas canisters or batteries in the trench. And when the German officers were raising their hands in the air to see if the wind was strong enough and in the right direction. To begin the attack, during the past 3 days, the winds were not in their favor, but on this day, August 6, 1915, at 4 in the evening, the winds were in their favor, and they released gas, and this gas was one of the worst gases that any soldier or human being could be exposed to, because it was a mixture of chlorine gas and bromine, and these two substances have the characteristics of being toxic substances that can kill you. Imagine then, when you mix the two together, it will be more dangerous, and as soon as they are exposed to water vapor or humidity in the atmosphere, it turns into a mixture of hydrochloric acid. This means that if this gas touches any person who is not wearing a mask or mask to protect against toxic gases, as soon as he inhales the gas, the person's fret will be filled with acid, causing the person's soul to decompose from the inside out. And the gas will enter their eyes and nose, and the acid will etch into their skulls. Once you touch this gas, no one can save you. You will die, but very slowly, and this is extremely painful. At this stage in the world wars, humanity still did not know anything about chemical weapons, and no one had used them before in any war. The Germans were the first people to use this weapon, and for this reason, the Russian army did not have any masks to protect its soldiers from poisonous gases. But the Germans knew this and were working on the masks, and this terrible poisonous gas began entering Auschwitz Castle from all directions. All the soldiers began to bleed from their eyes, nose, and ears, and began to bleed as they took out parts of the entrails. The Russians quickly realized that they had been poisoned, and that is why the rest of the soldiers who were not affected by the gas when they saw the rest of the soldiers happening to them. Thus, they cut off their clothes, put them in water, and put them on their noses. But to be honest, this temporary solution was not the problem. On the contrary, it made the situation worse. Because this gas combined with the moisture and water present on the piece of cloth, the Russian soldiers were literally doomed to death. On the other side, outside the walls of the castle, the Germans were wearing masks and holding weapons, and the attack began while the Russians were dying from inside the castle, and there was no place for them to escape. At that time, Vladimir was still coherent and standing on his feet inside the castle. He looked out of a small window inside the castle and saw from outside the Germans entering them and starting to attack them with random fire. At this moment, Vladimir knew that the first Germans passed the main door of the castle. They would finish off all the Russians, with weapons with them. But Vladimir's reaction was not afraid or sad. Instead, he became more determined and said that if they wanted to kill him, he would not be a coward, and they would have to pay dearly for Vladimir, who is known to be never a coward. During the past 6 months, when they were under siege by the German army in their trenches, any battle that took place between them was Vladimir the first person to run and be in the first row or in the front line of the fight, and any of the soldiers who was injured in the battle would crawl on the ground until the soldier was pulled out. The injured person was to be treated, as he had the fighting instinct. Vladimir entered the middle of the castle, where the remaining soldiers were still alive, who had been poisoned by the gas. They had only a little time left and died, but they were still standing on their men. Vladimir went to them despite his young age, and stood in front of them and said with all determination, "This is the moment in which we will all die, but the right thing that we do now is what will be written in our history." These two words that Vladimir said to the soldiers who were completely surrendering to death gave them determination and strength, even though they were bleeding from blood. Their eyes. One time, the Russian soldiers opened the doors of the castle, and all of them came out with their weapons, facing the Germans. They were running at the Germans, screaming terrifyingly with their weapons. The Germans expected that the chemical attack would be devastating to all Russian soldiers and that they would control Auschwitz Castle with ease because the Russians would be dead. But they did not expect it. The doors of the castle all opened and the Russians came out, wrapped and covered in pieces of cloth filled with blood. They moved like zombies or the living dead, holding their weapons and screaming like devils. The Germans saw this scene, became terrified, and retreated back. Vladimir and his soldiers began to eliminate the German army, and after the weapons ammunition ran out, they continued to advance among the thousands of German soldiers and took from the ground the weapons belonging to the German soldiers, who had died, and began killing the rest of the German soldiers until he reached the trenches in which the German soldiers were withdrawing from the battle. Before these trenches, there was a group of barbed wire. The Germans were so terrified that they were looking back while they were running, so they did not care about the road and entered the barbed wire. Vladimir and his zombie army used their front knives to attack the soldiers on the barbed wire. When Vladimir was doing this, a German soldier saw Vladimir and hit him in the stomach with a knife. Vladimir took the stab and did not feel any pain. He looked at the knife in his stomach and looked at the German soldier who was still holding on. The weapon, and terrified, Vladimir started screaming in the soldier's face. Blood appeared on his face. The German soldier was terrified and left the weapon and went back. After that, Vladimir grabbed the weapon and finished with the rest of the Germans. They were not hit with anything, and the Germans retreated and withdrew from the battle because they were afraid of the zombie army that launched a counterattack on them. Although the Germans were 70 times more numerous than the Russians who were still alive, they failed to seize Auschwitz Castle. The Germans who survived and returned to their trenches informed the rest of the team that the Russians had literally turned into zombies or the living dead. Any attack on them will not produce any results because they imagine that they are already dead. This was the belief of the Germans to the point that they remained very afraid to leave their trenches, and once the Russians succeeded, they repelled the German attack. Vladimir was still alive at this moment. He and the rest of the soldiers, who were almost undead, decided to return to the fort or castle after that. Vladimir gave them the last order, which was to destroy the castle, which is called the scorched earth policy. This means that if there is an infection in this place, they will take the place from me, or it will remain for me, or it will not remain and will not be of use to anyone else. At that time, the gas destroyed all the soldiers and Vladimir. When the Germans entered the castle after that and took control of it, it became clear that the inside of the castle was severely destroyed and that it no longer had any strategic value. After all the fatigue and effort that the Germans put forth during the past 6 months, it was in vain and there were huge material and human losses, and it all ended in vain. Vladimir was awarded the highest military honor in Russia after his death, and the battle that took place became a story, and an artistic painting was created for these soldiers who sacrificed their lives, and statues were made for them all over Russia. If you reach the end of the story and you like the story, I will do it for you and subscribe to know everything new. I hope you will tell me your opinion in the comments about whether you like stories like this or horror stories of another kind.